The Curse of Hollow Creek. It was late in the evening when the air around Hollow Creek grew thick with a damp, suffocating fog. The kind of fog that made it feel like the world had shrunk, like everything you knew was being swallowed up bit by bit. It was a fog that carried with it a chill, the kind that cut straight to your bones. And it wasn't just the fog that unnerved the townspeople of Hollow Creek. It was the stories. Whispers that floated through the air on cold winds, stories of strange happenings, disappearances, and things that no one had dared to speak about openly. For years, the town had been known for its serenity, a quiet little place tucked away in the hills of West Virginia. A place where people moved to get away from the world, to escape the noise and chaos of modern life. But ever since the mill at the edge of town had been abandoned, things had changed. Some said the mill had been cursed for as long as anyone could remember. Others claimed it was the land itself, haunted by something ancient, something evil. People began vanishing. First, it was just a few of the town's outsiders, people passing through who never made it to their destinations. But then it started happening to the locals. Maggie Lee was a native of Hollow Creek, having grown up in the town and never thinking of leaving. She was familiar with the stories, of course, but like most of the townsfolk, she had grown up dismissing them. They were just that, stories. Tall tales spun by the old-timers who sat on their porches, rocking in their chairs, spitting into the dirt and passing time with their imaginations. That was until the night she saw something that made her question everything she'd ever believed. Maggie had just finished her shift at the local diner and was walking home when the fog rolled in. The streetlights flickered as the mist swirled around her ankles, turning the familiar into something unrecognizable. The town was quiet. Too quiet. There were no sounds of laughter or conversation drifting from the homes along the street. No barking dogs. No creaking of porch swings. It was as if the town itself had become frozen in time. She quickened her pace, her breath fogging in the cold air. The sooner she reached home, the better. She wasn't one for superstitions, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up with every step. As she passed the old mill, she stopped. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The mill had always been a foreboding place, even as a child. But tonight it was different. There was a strange glow coming from one of the broken windows, an unnatural light that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Maggie swallowed hard. She knew she should just keep walking, ignore it, and go home. But something in her gut told her that she needed to see what was happening inside that mill. Curiosity, she thought, had always been her weakness. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the road and made her way up the overgrown path leading to the front door of the mill. It creaked open with little resistance, the hinges groaning as if they hadn't been used in decades. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of something rotten. The floor was covered in old, broken tools, torn fabrics, and debris from years of disuse. But it was the light that drew her in, the strange, eerie glow that seemed to pulse from the back of the mill. With every step, Maggie felt a sense of dread growing in her chest. She tried to ignore the rising panic that clutched at her throat, but it was impossible. The air was too still, too silent. There was something else here. Something that didn't belong. She rounded a corner and froze. Standing in the center of the room was a figure. A man tall, with broad shoulders, but his features were shrouded in shadow. His clothes were tattered, as if he had been wandering for days without rest. He stood motionless, staring at the ground. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as the hairs on her arms stood up. She had the sudden, overwhelming feeling that she wasn't alone. That whatever this was, it wasn't human. Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He slowly lifted his head, revealing eyes that were hollow, black, and empty. It was as if his soul had been drained from him. There was no recognition, no sign of life in those eyes, only a deep, consuming darkness. Suddenly he moved, his head jerking toward her with unnatural speed. Maggie gasped, stumbling backward, but she couldn't take her eyes off him. The figure raised a hand, and the air around her grew heavy, as though something was trying to pull her toward him. The light behind him flared brighter, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Before she could scream, a voice echoed in her mind, a whisper so faint, so chilling that it made her knees buckle. "You shouldn't have come. They are watching." She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was still, but the mill itself seemed to close in on her. The walls were shifting, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The air felt thick, suffocating. And then, with a sudden jolt, Maggie snapped back to reality. The door to the mill slammed shut behind her, and the light inside disappeared, leaving the place as dark and silent as it had been before. Her hands were shaking, her breath ragged as she fumbled for the doorknob. When she finally managed to open it, she ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, not stopping until she was safely inside her home, her front door locked behind her. But even then, the feeling didn't leave her. It lingered in the back of her mind, a whispering presence that she could not shake. She had seen it, the darkness in that mill. And she knew, deep in her bones, that whatever was lurking in that town was not just a story. It was real. And it was coming for her. The truth beneath Hollow Creek. Maggie didn't sleep that night. The images of the mill, of that man with hollow eyes, haunted her every waking moment. The whispering voice, "They are watching," replayed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that something unseen was waiting, just beyond the edge of her vision. The next morning the fog had lifted, but it didn't matter. The eerie sensation of being watched lingered, following her every step, even in the light of day. The townspeople seemed oblivious to the strange events of the night before, carrying on with their lives as if everything was normal. But Maggie couldn't stop herself from staring at the mill every time she passed, her eyes drawn to it like a magnet. Something was wrong. She knew that now. Hollow Creek wasn't just a town haunted by a few tall tales. There was something far darker hiding beneath the surface. It wasn't until she bumped into Frank, the local historian, that she learned the truth. Frank had always been a quiet man, someone who spent his days digging through old records and researching the town's past. But when Maggie saw him at the diner later that afternoon, his usual calm demeanor was gone. His face was drawn and pale, his eyes wide with worry. "Maggie," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to talk. It's about the mill. I know what you saw." Maggie froze, her stomach twisting. "How do you know what I saw?" "I've been studying the town's history for years," Frank whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear.
"And I've heard the stories, the real stories. The ones no one wants to talk about. What's happening in Hollow Creek isn't just superstition. It's something much older." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" Frank looked around again before lowering his voice even further. "The mill wasn't always just a mill. It was built on land that was once sacred, ancient land. And that land has a dark history. A history of rituals, sacrifices, and a curse." Maggie's heart raced. "Sacrifices?" Frank nodded grimly. "The original settlers here weren't just farmers or mill workers. They came from an old cult, a secret group that believed in summoning spirits from beyond the veil. They didn't just worship the land, they used it to open doors to something evil. When the mill was built, it was built with one purpose in mind, to keep the door open, to keep the darkness contained." Maggie's mind spun. "What kind of darkness? What are you saying?" "The people who disappeared," Frank continued, his voice growing more urgent, "weren't just lost. They were taken. That man you saw in the mill? He's one of them. A soul lost to the curse, a part of the thing that's waiting to escape." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. "So you're saying it's real? That thing in the mill? The darkness?" Frank's eyes met hers, his expression grave. "It's not just a ghost. It's an entity, a malevolent force that feeds off the town, off the people. The cult believed they could control it, that they could use it to gain power. But they made a fatal mistake. They opened a door that could never be closed." Maggie's head swam with the weight of Frank's words. She had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed made her blood run cold. "And now," she whispered, "now it's awake. The mill is a prison, and every time someone goes near it, the curse strengthens. That's why people disappear. They're claimed by the darkness." The diner grew quiet as Frank's words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking into the room like a stone in water. Maggie felt the urge to run, to escape, but she knew there was no escaping it now. The darkness was already here, and it was too late to turn back. But she had to try. She had to find a way to stop it before more people vanished. "There has to be a way to stop it," Maggie said, her voice trembling but determined. Frank looked at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "There is. But it's dangerous. The only way to break the curse is to seal the door, the one under the mill. But no one's ever done it. No one's even survived trying." Maggie's mind raced. She couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She couldn't just sit back and let the town fall to whatever was lurking beneath the surface. If she didn't act, if she didn't try to stop it, more people would vanish. Jenny, the man in the mill, her, they would all be lost forever. "I'll do it," Maggie said, her voice low but steady. Frank shook his head. "You don't understand. You can't do it alone." "I have to," Maggie replied, standing up. "I won't let this evil take my town. I won't let it take me." Frank stared at her, his expression torn. "Maggie, please. You don't know what you're dealing with. You're playing with forces you can't control." But Maggie was already walking away, her mind made up. She had to go back to the mill. She had to face whatever was lurking there, and stop it before it claimed anyone else. The town of Hollow Creek, and everything she knew, depended on it. The sun was setting as she made her way to the mill, the fog returning, thick and suffocating. The air was colder now, and the darkness seemed to stretch out before her like an abyss. But Maggie wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had seen the truth, and there was no turning back. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let the town fall to whatever evil had been unleashed here. When she reached the mill, the door was open, waiting for her. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest, the shadows swallowing her whole. And then she heard it. The whisper again, that cold, hollow voice that seemed to come from every direction. "You shouldn't have come, Maggie." She turned, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness, and the sound of her own breath, loud and deafening in the silence. "Come," the voice said again, and this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Maggie stepped forward, determined to face whatever awaited her in the depths of the mill. She had come too far to turn back now. But as she crossed the threshold, she realized one terrifying truth. The darkness didn't just want her to come. It wanted her to stay. The man turned slowly, his eyes locking with Maggie's. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his smile was unnatural, like it was forced, like he didn't have the power to stop it. He stepped toward her, his movements jerky, as if he were being controlled by something far more powerful than his own will. The heart of the darkness. Maggie's steps echoed in the mill as she walked deeper into the shadowed interior. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as the whispers returned, now louder, more insistent. They were all around her, curling through the air like tendrils of smoke, reaching for her mind, whispering secrets of the past and warnings of what was to come. "You shouldn't have come, Maggie." The voice came again, this time more distorted, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "You belong to us now." Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She could feel it now, the weight of something ancient, something evil, pressing down on her, watching her every move. She had to keep going. She had to find the source, the heart of whatever darkness lay within the mill, and stop it before it claimed more lives. She stepped carefully over the debris, her feet brushing against old, rotting wood and broken tools. The mill was an eerie labyrinth, with walls that seemed to close in on her with every step. But through the darkness, she could see it, a faint light in the distance, flickering from what looked like a stairway leading down into the earth. The heart of the curse. The whispering voice, now almost a growl, filled the air. "You will never escape." But Maggie was resolute. She had already seen what was at stake. If she didn't stop this now, the town of Hollow Creek would continue to vanish, piece by piece, consumed by the evil that had been released so long ago. She approached the stairway, feeling the cool draft from below. The smell of damp earth and decay filled her nostrils as she descended into the blackness. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself was resisting her, pulling her back. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a vast chamber, the walls lined with strange, ancient symbols carved into the stone. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, but what terrified her most was the sight in the center of the room. There, in the middle of the chamber, was a large stone altar. Bloodstains marked its surface, dark and dried. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, faintly glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. And standing before the altar, his back to her, was the figure, the man she had seen in the mill, His hollow eyes turned toward the altar as if waiting for something, or someone. "It's time," the voice whispered again, this time echoing from the depths of the room, as if it had come from everywhere at once. "You have awakened the darkness. Now it claims you." The man turned slowly, his eyes locking with Maggie's. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his smile was unnatural, like it was forced, like he didn't have the power to stop it. He stepped toward her, his movements jerky, as if he were being controlled by something far more powerful than his own will. Maggie's breath hitched in her throat, but she didn't back down. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely a whisper in the vast room. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. "I was like you once," he said, his voice rough, ragged. "I came here, seeking answers, seeking the truth. But the truth, it has a price." He paused, his eyes widening in a mixture of pain and fear. "I was chosen. And now you have been too?" Maggie's eyes widened. "Chosen? For what?" The man took another step forward, and Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "To be part of it. The curse. The darkness that has been trapped here for centuries. You've come to free it, to awaken it, and now you will serve it. Just like the rest of us." Before Maggie could respond, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the chamber seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The walls around her began to shift, the symbols glowing brighter, and the air grew heavy with the stench of decay and rot. A dark shape began to form above the altar. It was a figure, indistinct at first, but as it grew, it took on a form, a towering, shadowy entity, its eyes glowing with malevolent light. It wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries to be released. The man's voice shook as he spoke again. "You were never meant to stop it. No one can." Maggie's heart raced, but she couldn't let the terror overwhelm her. She remembered Frank's words. The only way to break the curse was to seal the door. She had to act now, before the thing in front of her had a chance to claim her soul, like it had with so many others before her. Without thinking, Maggie reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers closing around the small silver pendant she had kept with her since her childhood. It had always seemed insignificant, just a trinket from her grandmother. But now, in this moment, it felt like it held some kind of power. A connection to something greater, something that might be able to stop whatever this was. She raised the pendant high above her head, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. The shadows in the room flickered, the air grew still, and the entity above the altar let out a low growl, as if it were being repelled by the pendant's light. With all the strength she could muster, Maggie shouted, "I won't let you in!" The pendant flashed with blinding light, and the shadows in the room recoiled, as if burning from the light's touch. The entity screeched, its form writhing, struggling against the power that Maggie had unleashed. The man, too, seemed to falter, his body trembling, as if the darkness that had taken hold of him was weakening. But Maggie knew she couldn't hold on much longer. She needed to finish this. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on the altar, and with a fierce cry, she thrust the pendant toward the stone. The moment it made contact, the ground shook violently, and the shadows that had clung to the room seemed to shatter, breaking apart like glass. The entity let out one final, blood-curdling scream, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room fell silent. Maggie stood there, panting, her heart still racing. The air had cleared, the oppressive darkness lifted, and the symbols on the walls had faded. The man, his face now pale and lifeless, collapsed to the floor, his body nothing more than a husk, emptied of whatever had controlled him. She had done it. The curse was broken. But as she turned to leave, the ground beneath her feet trembled again, a low rumbling starting deep below the earth. The shadows may have been gone, but the evil had left its mark on Hollow Creek. The door had been sealed, but Maggie knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Whatever had lurked beneath the mill, whatever had been unleashed, would find a way to return. And Hollow Creek would never be the same again. Maggie stepped into the fading light, the weight of her victory heavy on her shoulders, knowing that the town, the people, and the mill would always be haunted by what had been unleashed. She had stopped the curse, but the question still lingered in her mind: what if it's not truly gone? The whispers were silent for now. But Maggie knew, evil never stays quiet for long.